Hi everyone, and welcome to the latest webinar from Zoe. We're talking about the Omicron variant. What does it mean for the future of COVID? And today I'm joined by Professor Wendy Barclay, Head of Infectious Diseases at Imperial College London, and an expert in the subject. And for those who don't know me, I'm Professor Tim Spector, Lead Scientist in the Zoe COVID study and Professor of Epidemiology at King's College in London. So thanks to everyone who submitted their questions. We're looking forward to getting some answers and discussing broadly this whole topic of Omicron, a highly transmissible SARS-CoV-2 virus strain, which was first identified in South Africa by very diligent scientists there last year, and then swept rapidly through the UK and the globe, leading to rising numbers of infections. And there's even now a second variant of Omicron, which we're going to discuss briefly, which is under the name of BA2, or the tabloids are calling it the stealth variant, because it has certain properties. But in this webinar, we're going to be talking mainly about why it became the dominant strain in the UK so quickly, how effective vaccines are against it. Is it really more mild? Does it last a shorter time or longer time? And what this means for the future of COVID, and what we can perhaps learn from this variant about the future. What do the next couple of years hold for us as we get new variants? So lots to cover. And Wendy, it's great to have you back with us. I do enjoy our chats. And you're an expert in these respiratory viruses, and you've been doing this for a long time now. In very simple terms, before we get into any detail, what is the Omicron variant? What's the best way to think of it?
So thanks for having me back, Tim. Lovely to be here again. Omicron is the latest of a string of variants of the same virus, SARS-CoV-2, which was the virus which emerged back in 2019 and of course spread around the world through 2020, 2021, and now here we are in 2022 with Omicron. And as we've discussed before, when these RNA viruses replicate in people, they throw up an incredible number of mutations. And the mutations which confer what we call selective advantage, which make the virus better under the circumstances where it is, are the ones which will win through, which will predominate. Now, a lot of those mutations may be good in one circumstance, not another, in one person, not another. But if they're very good at transmitting through many, many different people, then that's the type of variant we'd expect to see. And I think Omicron is hit the nail on the head, if you like, with this combination of being able to transmit very well, but also in the face of what we currently present to it as a human host, which is that a lot of people have either been previously infected or now been vaccinated. The Omicron has this sort of double whammy of being able to transmit in those people as well, which gives it the edge over all the previous variants. That's
great. A very sneaky little variant it is too. So there's a question from that's come to both of us really about what have we seen recently with Omicron rates in the UK. Perhaps I'll take it from we use my epidemiology hat. But do correct me that I think it's when we stopped counting, it was about 96% of UK cases when the government stopped looking at it systematically at the end of the year. So they just sort of gave up and said, well, it's close to 100% now. So currently, if you've got the virus, I think in the UK, it's over 95% sure it's going to be Omicron. Is that your understanding, Wendy?
Totally agree. I mean, the latest REACT survey is out at the moment, talking about what was found in the first 2 weeks of January in the people who, more than 100,000 people who just swabbed themselves at home and sent in, and then that was sequenced. I think those numbers are around 99% Omicron, and the prevalence rate is 4% or above. So one in, more than 1 in 20 people being positive with Omicron.
And I guess the bigger picture is that we've, for the latest rates of Omicron, that's the total ones. And I think people need to go to my weekly updates on the Zoe app, but see what's happening for the latest data. But we certainly know that a couple of weeks ago, we hit the peak of over 200,000 cases, and we now know they're creeping up again. And so we hoped they were dropping, but then school kids went up, and that's paid to that optimism that it was all going to go away. So we're certainly stuck with Omicron for a while, I think, is the reason it's not going to suddenly disappear. So we've got another question here. What about Omicron in other countries? And what's going on in countries like the US, where they might look as if there's a Delta and Omicron are sort of coexisting, and how common is that, Wendy?
Well, I think, as we've seen throughout this pandemic, different countries lag behind each other in where they are with the race, if you like, between these different variants. But uniformly, what we're seeing around the world is that Omicron is becoming dominant and displacing Delta or anything else that's there. So the US is also seeing rise in Omicron. And I think as weeks go by, Delta will lose that race, because the selective pressures in the US are certainly very similar to how they are here. And other countries who do a fantastic job of monitoring what's going on, places like Denmark, where Omicron is clearly surging. And also, for example, in India, where Omicron is predominant. So I think everywhere you look, Omicron is displacing the previous variant, becoming the dominant strain.
Okay, so there might be a few outliers where Delta and Omicron are around, but in most places it's taking over. Is that generally true?
Well, yes, and what I'm saying is that over time that situation will change and Omicron will win. I think everywhere.
Okay, so a lot of people are asking, why is it so good at transmitting, getting into one person and going to another, compared to, say, Delta? What is it doing better, really, than the previous variants? Yeah,
so I mean, this is a double whammy, as I said. I mean, the most obvious explanation is that Omicron is what we call an antigenic escape variant. So it has changed the way it looks to our immune system with all these mutations in the spike protein so much. Unprecedented number of, more than 30 mutations, all amino acid changes, making the spike protein look completely different. That means that the antibodies that we made in response to our previous infections or our vaccines just don't see Omicron as well as they do see Delta or indeed Alpha or the first wave viruses before them. Remember, the vaccines are all based on the sequence of the spike of the first wave. So as you get further and further away, and Omicron really is the furthest away so far, those antibodies just don't see it very well. So in a partially immune or a nearly totally immune population, Omicron has the edge. There is also some evidence that even in unvaccinated people, Omicron is good at transmitting. And that's, again, a hallmark that we've seen as every wave of this pandemic has come through. Each of the variants of concern which have predominated and won this race around the world are the ones which transmit well. And Omicron appears to have solved the solution, if you like, or solved the problem that SARS-CoV-2 will face as we become more immune. How does it escape that immunity but continue to transmit well? And it does both. And so I think the increased numbers we see is a combination of it being able to infect more people, even if they're previously vaccinated, even if they've been previously infected, it can still infect them. And also that it's a good transmitter.
Okay, so I get the immune side, and of course that's due to all these, changes in the spike protein, the mutation, so it sort of fools the immune system. But when we were discussing Delta, we thought this is Delta's really clever. It's found a way. I think it was droplet size and things like this. It found ways to get from one person's mouth into another's through the way the virus is projected. Is Omicron working in a similar way? So is it like as good as Delta in terms of getting from one person to another, or is it different?
But I would say that biologically speaking, what's really fascinating is that Omicron has solved the problem in a very different biological way. So Delta, we think, was very, very good at coming out from people's noses and then getting into the next cell. And it was very good at cell surface entry. So when the virus first attaches itself to the cell, it can go in two sort of different routes. One is to sort of fuse its body with the cell surface body and inject directly, if you like, its genetic material, its RNA, into the body of the cell. And the other is a much more conventional route, which we call endocytosis, where the virus is taken in by the cell in a bubble, and then it sort of moves through the bubble and eventually fuses inside the cell. So it's a quite different biological process. And what several groups around the world working on Omicron have shown recently is that Omicron is using that second route of entry, whereas Delta is using the first route of entry. And that gives them really different biologies. And we can come on talk, in a minute what that might mean for things like symptoms and severity. But from a fundamental biological process, whether or not this ability to use the endocytic route has given Omicron a transmission edge is not currently clear. We've got one preprint out there sort of putting forward the idea that perhaps that gives it the possibility to enter more cells in your nose, so that a droplet landing on your nose has got a better chance of getting into the first cell it lands on if it's an Omicron than if it's a Delta. Delta's a little bit more fussy about the cells it can use to enter. So that could be it, but I think it's very, very early days, and there's all sorts of other changes to do with the physical properties of the virus, which I'm sure will be uncovered by others.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Also interesting, because you wonder why physical barriers haven't been more effective. So I remember discussing some of the early trials of these like cold prevention barriers like First Defense and other ones that in theory should make it harder, but don't seem to have had a big impact. Or have they not been tested much recently?
Well, I haven't seen much testing out there, but I mean, things like First Defense, they work against certain viruses very, very well, possibly because they're pH fragile. The First Defense has got quite a low pH. So something like flu, which is very pH fragile and just falls apart if it experiences an acidic pH, very well blocked by First Defense. The thing with the coronaviruses and SARS-CoV-2 shown very early on is that it's quite robust in the environment. It can sit around for quite a long time, and acidic pH on its own doesn't seem to really impact it. So I think that those kinds of barriers are perhaps not, let's say they weren't developed necessarily with coronaviruses in mind. Back in the day, people were more worried by flu and cold viruses than they were coronaviruses. So there might be in the future, I think, barriers that could be developed that were much better at blocking coronaviruses. And I'm sure there are lots of people out there trying to do that. But I think the current products we've got were not really designed for that, and they don't do the job as well as they might.
And just so people who don't know what we're talking about, the First Defense is a brand name of a whole range of sprays that you put up your nose at the first sign of a cold, or to prevent a cold if you think you're in a risky situation that is a sort of physical barrier. It just puts a spray up there, which I think has, as you said, changed the pH, but also produces a sort of slightly slimy layer, so in theory the virus slips off. So it was a nice idea, but unfortunately Omicron's much too clever for it.
Well, I think SARS-CoV-2 in general, as I say, I think there's a fascinating area to understand how all these different respiratory viruses do deal with the nose environment. There's mucus and what the effect of the barriers are on them, but still a long way to go there.
No, we're learning a lot very fast, definitely, about this in a subject that was probably rather much more slow moving than now. Okay, so we've got a question here about how we know when new variants are appearing. I think we're going to discuss this a bit more when we talk about the new variant. But currently PCR testing in about a third of the country does pick up Omicron, and the government is doing a series of regular routine tests, and we've heard about the REACT study, which comes out every few weeks, but the government are looking at this regularly. So I don't think we need to worry that they won't be detected. That's going to continue. And of course, studies like ours that do monitor symptoms will pick up anything strange that isn't being picked up by normal tests. And that's one advantage of us carrying on with the Zoe study and the wider health studies, without being restricted to just what's being picked up by tests. And I think we have to keep an open mind, if you agree, Wendy, about not being too reliant on the PCR test in case suddenly things do change or it gets harder to test positive. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think you made some good points. We need all kinds of surveys if we really want to know what's going on. The PCR tests, the beauty of those are that you get some level of genetic information about the variant itself. So the variants are all different from one another because of their genetic makeup. We were very good at picking up the alpha variant, which was the first one really of the first variant of concern way back in the UK in Christmas 2020, January 2021, and now Omicron. And that's because by using the combination of PCR tests that we used, you could see that one of them didn't work anymore. And the reason that happens is because the sequence of the variant changes. So the primers, the reagents in the PCR test don't see it. You have 3 simultaneous tests, 2 of them work and 1 of them doesn't. It tells you you've got SARS-CoV-2 there, but it's changed in one particular place in its genetics. And that has been incredibly useful for tracking the emergence of these variants. Omicron, at least the first Omicron, and I know we'll probably come on and talk about variants of Omicron, but the first Omicron was picked up in its growth because it was exactly doing this. It was sort of failing one of the tests and we could see it emerging. There is a danger if we don't do PCR that we don't have that information. And of course, some of that PCR material, which is the RNA of the virus, is then sequenced as well. So we get a lot of information about the variant and how to track it and the genetic basis of any changes that are going on. But you absolutely have to couple those with other kinds of surveys that count how much symptoms are out there and what type of symptoms to sort of interpret all the biology together.
Do you think we've got too focused on the nose and only swabbing the nose, which is the current government advice, that we might be missing new variants that say target the throat or target the gut, and we should be perhaps giving broader advice when people are ill to swab in more places? Do you agree with the government on this, that we should be just focusing on the nose, or do you think it should be broader?
I mean, if it was me, I'd have samples from lots of places to understand all the biology. But I do understand that, that there are cost implications, but perhaps more importantly, if you want to do a really good survey, you have to make it doable for people. And a nose only swab might be easier for lots of people to do than the nose and throat.
Is there any danger? I mean, because I've been recommending people do know their throat first and then their nose on the same swab, because believe the pickup rate is higher, but we don't have recent Omicron data on that. No, but we could be missing less cases. And so if people are worried about being infectious, that's what they probably should do. Are there any dangers of that, apart from, some people saying, oh, it's too much fuss, I'm not going to do it? Is there any technical reason that you shouldn't do it?
I don't think there's a technical reason why you shouldn't do it. It's just that the swabs have got very short, so reaching to the back of your throat's quite hard.
Need long fingers, yeah.
I mean, we at Imperial, we have done a human challenge study where we took separate nose and throat swabs, and we did PCR and we did lateral flows. We found in that study, which worked with a first wave variant, not Delta, not Omicron, we had a very good correlation between people emitting virus into their environment and being nose positive. So the throat came up early and gave an indication that you were going to become positive, but actually we didn't see people putting virus out into the environment until they were nose positive. So it depends why we're doing these swabs, what we're going to do with the information. If you want to know at the very first instance that there's a chance you're going to develop symptoms and become ill, then probably swabbing everywhere is fine. There is an argument that nose swabbing would correlate more with you being infectious to others, and if that's the purpose, then go with that. But as I say, the danger with all of this is that every new variant comes along and its biology slightly changes. We probably need to reassess those sort of nose versus throat results in the context of the new variant as well, to be sure.
But if you've got cold-like symptoms and you're at home, would you swab both your throat and your nose?
Yeah, probably.
So would I. And I think most doctors I talk to, if you're looking for infection, you swab. You don't just rely on one spot. And I think makes common sense to most of us.
In all honesty, I'm quite impressed as to how good the public have become at self-swabbing anyway. I mean, at the start of this pandemic, there were public health officials who would have thought we couldn't rely on people to take their own swabs.
Many.
All credit to the public. They do pretty well at it, I would say.
And I think despite a whole lack of real solid guidance from the government, people are doing the right thing and swabbing regularly. And I think they've taken it into their own hands, really. And I think that's what we're seeing of our app users. And they want to learn more. That's why they're listening to this. What about swabbing your poo sample if you've got gut symptoms? Do you think we'll be doing that in 6 months' time?
No, I don't. I mean, I don't think we'll be doing quite as much swabbing in 6 months' time as we're doing now. And I don't think anybody's going to suggest that we start doing poo. To my knowledge, there haven't been any infectious virus found in feces. And so, you can find all sorts of things in poo because you swallow your mucus. There will be remnants and fragments, but I don't think that's the direction we're going to go with this.
Right, because okay, we'll come back to the gut symptoms later, but that's really, really helpful, Wendy. Thank you. So I think the next question brings us on to BA2, the stealth variant. So the epidemiology is that it's now the predominant, correct me if I'm wrong, it's now the predominant variant in Denmark, which is the country that does the most sequencing of viruses. So others may be, but they wouldn't know about it. And it's certainly doubling here every few days from a low base. And I think we're probably over 5%, roughly. And it seems to be increasing here. And it's in India and it's in other Scandinavian countries. Tell us about it. How is it different, and why is it beating Omicron, at least in Denmark?
Yeah, so let's be clear. So Omicron can be split into at least 3 what we call sub-lineages, which we've called BA1, BA2, and BA3. And you can sort of trace all of those back to probably a common ancestor. So they probably all came from the same place, but then they diverged into 3 slightly different flavors of Omicron. And the first Omicron, which seems to have made it out from South Africa, or its origin, I mean, South Africa picked it up first, so we believe somewhere in that part of the world is where this came from. The first one out really was the BA1. But as you say, where you've seen BA1 and BA2 in the same country, in the same location, it does seem that over time, again, BA2 seems to have a slight advantage. Now, BA2, just like BA1, it has this double whammy ability. So it's got lots of changes on the spike protein, which mean that the antibodies that we've made against vaccine or previous infection are not seeing it very well. And I haven't seen lots of data on that yet, but the data I have seen suggests that there's not a huge amount of difference in the antigenic escape level of the BA1 versus the BA2. So if that is the case, it would say that BA2 isn't winning the race somewhere like Denmark because it's better at escaping the vaccine. It would suggest that it's got some other attribute about it that makes it better at transmitting. And early days yet, so we have absolutely no data to support that, but that would be the interpretation of the epidemiology that we see, that BA2 has all of the antigenic escape of BA1, but also some other changes which help it be rather even better, if you like, than BA1 at transmitting. And as I say, we don't have the biology. The number of spike changes in BA2 is somewhat less than in BA1. So one way of interpreting this is that BA1 is kind of almost like overblown a little bit in its antigenic escape. It's accumulated so many changes that it's kind of compromised to a degree its own fitness, and BA2 has sort of struck a better balance with the escape from the antibodies, but maintaining its good transmissibility. But I think there's lots of biology to come to try and sort out the difference between BA1 and BA2. And going back to what I was saying about how you see these things when you do the PCR tests, the point about BA2 is that it isn't missed by the one of the 3 tests that we do. So whereas we call BA1 an S gene target failure or an S gene dropout, and we can see very clearly where we've got BA1 rising in the background of Delta, now BA2 has come back in and it is picked up by those original S gene primer sets. So now you see S gene coming back in and scoring positive. So, I mean, again, in a sort of very fortuitous way, these PCR primer sets that we use routinely to test out what's going on have given a really good window into the epidemiology as BA1 and BA2 have sort of played out across January in various parts of the world.
Okay, so we will be able to monitor it increasing in the UK through the third of the labs that do have this facility to separate them out. So
yes,
so it's not totally true to call it the stealth variant.
no,
Is that right?
not no. It's a nice name, but I don't think it's quite accurate, because we can, in many ways, it's less of a stealth than Omicron, because all our PCR primers pick it up, as opposed to Omicron, which was evading one of them.
Okay, all right. So we will be able to see it. So we need to give it a different name. And it's not. We keep calling it a variant of concern, but what you're saying is it's part of an existing lineage.
Yes.
And so it's
yes.
a bit
So
of
this
semantics about whether you call it a variant or not. Is that right?
Yes. I mean, this all gets quite technical about how you define your naming system. In the UK, UK Health Security Agency have always, for one point, compared what's coming to what was immediately before. And if what's coming and what's emerging is a little bit worrying, it becomes what we call a variant under investigation, or a VUI, because that just means we need to look closely at this. You know, we've seen something happening on the screens where we're monitoring the sequences, and we need to look. That does not define it in WHO terms as a variant of concern, which is a variant which is doing things which mean that you can't control it in some way with vaccines, drugs, etc. So BA2 will eventually, I mean, is a variant of concern, just like BA1 is, but they are two sub-lineages of the same variant of concern.
Okay, so slightly semantics, but so I'm sure the press will call it a new variant.
Yeah.
Because
It
we
won't
don't have
get,
any
it won't
better
get
words.
a new name. It won't get a new Greek letter. It will.
It won't.
No.
Okay, so Omicron 2 or something, yeah, or whatever.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. So, and just on an epidemiological note, I think what is reassuring, people are obviously frightened when something new comes along, we don't know much about it. It's presumably slightly more transmissible than the BA1 variant lineage. But the good news from Denmark is that it hasn't really had changed hospital admission rates. So I don't think we're seeing more deaths or severe disease, which means it's probably certainly no worse than the existing BA1, which I think is important for people to realize. Although it could have been, because, you know, I think there are at least 20 different mutations on there, and we don't understand how they all work in the human or different susceptible people. So we sometimes have to just wait and see what the epidemiology shows.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's important here is whether we're talking about percentage rates, if you like, of severe disease to case numbers or not. So I agree that in proportional terms, if you catch BA2 or BA1, there's no evidence that you're more likely to end up going to hospital. But we do have to remember that if there is more BA2 about, then more vulnerable people whose own immune systems didn't respond as well as they might to the vaccine, etc., may get it. And therefore, we may see more people having to go to hospital, because it's a numbers game. The more viruses out there, the more likely that sort of very, vulnerable proportion of elderly and clinically extremely vulnerable people may be exposed.
Yeah, but I think the current epidemiology, is fairly reassuring on BA1 that hasn't been nearly as bad as thought. So I think a lot of people are concerned. So I just want to make sure that we're not fueling lots of worry every time there's a new lineage.
I agree entirely. Again, what's been very interesting, I think, about Omicron's explosion in the run up to Christmas and beyond is that it was very much in the young, healthy age group, the 18 to 45-year-olds. That's really where it took hold and spread. I think it's now beginning to move out a little bit into younger and older people, and whether or not in the end that's going to be BA1 or BA2 which reaches those communities, I think things look okay, things look good. And I'm not for a minute that there's good actually animal data suggesting that Omicron variants are indeed less severe in the disease they cause. So no cause for concern. But again, just to emphasize that there are people in our community who are more vulnerable than others to the bad outcomes, and just the more virus there, the more worrying.
A question from Mayo Marriott is saying, can we look at new variants when they first detected and really work out, could this be lethal? Is this the rare killer one that's going to upset all our optimism?
Yeah, so certainly from the point of view of antigenic escape, we're getting very good at that, because there's such a lot of fantastic work that's gone on the defining the structure of spike and the way that antibodies see it, exactly which bits of spike would, when they change, would throw off the antibodies. And I think with Omicron, that was absolutely called out. I mean, all credit to the South African group who saw this sequence emerge and spread in their own country and called out that they were concerned because they could predict this antigenic escape. What I think has surprised us all with Omicron is this less severe disease that it seems to be associated with. And I don't think we're good yet at understanding that. And therefore, I don't think we've yet got sufficient confidence that we can call out each new variant is going to be more severe or less severe than any other. Thanks
for that. So another question that comes out, is I'm asked by the media, but this is, have the symptoms changed from previous variants? And really, this is a sort of general question as we move across the variants, which is surprisingly hard. People think it's an easy thing to measure, but actually these are shifting goalposts. And even with, millions of people reporting with Zoe their daily symptoms, we're now in a very different place to where we were 2 years ago. Nearly all of us have been vaccinated or had it exposed to an infection, so we're not reacting the same way as we did in those initial ones in Alpha. But I think certainly we've gradually seen a slight lessening in the symptoms as far as we can tell, and certainly for Omicron, moving from Delta to Omicron, the one thing we're definitely seeing is less anosmia, loss of smell. Which sort of is nice because it means less brain attacks, which might be really important for long-term, long COVID, etc. But we are seeing increases in sore throat, and these are all statistically significant now. So the people with the cold symptoms of sore throat, and progressively we've seen less and less people with the classic Wuhan symptoms, and so they've dropped right down the list as this seems to be focusing in the upper respiratory area. And obviously there's always exceptions, and so people think, I'm talking averages, so you can still get any of, I think, 30 symptoms from it. So don't feel left out if you're at home and you've got a symptom I'm not mentioning. But it's, we have seen, we're sort of unsure whether GI symptoms are increasing. We sort of touched on this about, you said that if it does affect the GI system, as it does often in kids, you're saying there's no evidence it's really transmissible that way through the old-fashioned like novavirus sort of routes. But do you think we could be missing cases because it's mainly GI, and in those cases you don't get the virus in the nose?
I don't think we're missing a huge proportion of cases for that reason.
Okay.
I mean, just going back to the biology and what we can do, and of course this is all lab-based stuff and with caveats, not the real world as you're dealing in, but I think it's very reassuring if things add up. So, we can see from the biology that I described earlier that Omicron is using different pathways to enter cells. That absolutely adds up with the loss of the anosmia symptoms. Because I think that the virus was previously able to target cells of the olfactory system and move backwards towards the brain. And this change in its behavior in terms of how it enters cells absolutely explains that it wouldn't be doing that anymore. So I think we can add up the biology and explain that. And we can see, for example, in the cell systems, the culture systems we use in the lab, that Omicron is very, very good at getting going with infection in nasal cells. So I think that that sort of is in line with a lot of people saying that they've got much more of a head cold with Omicron. It's more in the upper respiratory tract than in the lung, much less difficulties in breathing, for example, reported, but more sort of up the top. And when we put Omicron on sort of gut cells in the lab, actually there's no enhancement in its ability to infect those. So I don't think Omicron is retargeting into the guts and using new transmission routes. I think it's very much becoming more like a seasonal coronavirus and is in the head.
The data we presented last week for the first time, which is still pretty fresh, about the duration being shorter of Omicron versus Delta. So we found that about a third of people recovered within 3 days and only about 15% of Delta. So twice as many people are recovering in a shorter time compared to Delta when we adjust for vaccination status and age. And I think, does that make sense given what you know about the virus?
Yeah, so the kinetics that we see in the lab is that Omicron, as I say, comes in and really gets going fast. It peaks very, very early, faster than Delta did, but then it's seen rather easily by the person's immune system. Even if they haven't been vaccinated, we have what we call the innate immune system, which detects a virus and shuts things down. And it seems to be shut down rather quickly. So I think what's interesting is that Omicron has learned to transmit very quickly from one person to the next. It sort of has a big burst at the beginning. And then actually from a virus's point of view, everything else afterwards is irrelevant in evolutionary terms. It doesn't matter if it makes you sick or if it lingers on for a long time. If it's already efficiently got out in the very early days, even perhaps before you're symptomatic, then that's a very successful virus strategy.
Okay, let's move on to how good the vaccines are, because I mean, we've covered a fair bit of this because you've been saying that obviously it's finding a way around. It is infecting people, but it's clearly not producing a severe condition. So just talk us about why things aren't as severe when you've had the vaccines.
Yeah, I mean, we still don't completely understand how these wonderful vaccines that have been developed so quickly work, but they certainly do. They certainly work to keep people out of hospital and prevent death. The most likely explanation from an immunological point of view is the T cell response, which remembers the type of virus you've been infected with or vaccinated against, and can come in after a lag of a few days. So you still get infected, but after a lag of a few days, these T cells activate and come and destroy the cells which are producing the virus and destroy the virus and clear it from your system. And that means there isn't the opportunity for the virus to linger on. COVID was always a bit of a biphasic disease. Many people had mild COVID and got better after a week or 10 days. And it was the people that didn't get better that ended up getting severely ill and going to hospital when perhaps the virus descended to their lungs or triggered some other pathways that hadn't been controlled by that point. So I think what the vaccines do is just decrease the viral burden, shorten the amount of time that you've got a lot of virus in your body, and help you fight it off and rid yourself of the virus. And that means you get infected, you can potentially transmit onto someone else, but you don't get very, very sick. And, you know, this, in the early days, when you had a very good vaccine match with the first wave vaccine against, let's say, alpha variant, the match was rather good in all senses. The vaccines were very good at preventing infection as well as disease. But gradually, as the variants have changed more and more, the vaccines now don't prevent infection very well, but they still prevent disease, which tells us there's probably different parts of the immune system behaving in different ways to confer those two different types of protection. And
do you think there's a difference between infecting people who had Delta before and those who had a vaccine before? And there's some discrepancy in our data last week about our reinfection rates. We found about 7% of people were getting reinfected every day. 90 odd percent hadn't had a natural infection. The REACT study found surprisingly to me, 65% reinfection rates, which seems very high. Any broad, I mean, I know you probably can't comment on those differences, but
yeah, I mean,
in terms of the vaccine, or in terms of, and the virus itself, how?
So we've obviously very interested in this. Each variant is different from the starting virus, but it's not necessarily a linear difference. They all can sort of spew out in almost, you can picture it in three-dimensional space. And people like Derek Smith up at Cambridge University have been mapping these sort of antigenic maps for flu viruses for years to understand how each different variant relates to each other. And he's doing that for SARS-CoV-2, as are other people here and around the world. And I think what's remarkable to me is that in many ways, the Wuhan, the original one, sits in the middle, and some of the other variants sort of have gone out from Wuhan, but in different directions. And the two that are most different from each other are Delta and Omicron. That sort of makes sense because Omicron came in and displaced Delta. And it sort of says that even if you were infected with Delta, you weren't very well protected from Omicron. And I think we're seeing that. We've got some animal studies which indicate that could be the case as well. And I think it's really important going forward, where we think about what the future of SARS-CoV-2 vaccines might be, that we really get to grips with this, because choosing the right vaccine a few months in advance of when it might actually, you might want it to work, all depends on choosing one which has got the best chance of working against as many of the different possible emerging variants which may come along. And
so you hope Delta Plus doesn't come along again. That's what you want, isn't it?
Well, yes, I mean, absolutely. I think what it tells us from an epidemiological point of view, and it'd be interesting to pick apart your study and react in this context, would be, my prediction would be that people that got Delta, probably not vaccinated, but unvaccinated people who just got Delta, may not be very well protected at all against Omicron, because that Delta Omicron is a long way apart. And so I think that's a really strong argument, that thinking that by previous infection you're going to get good protection against everything else is not the case. And you're actually better off being vaccinated. Even if you get infected on the top of that vaccine, what we can see is that broadens out the immune response and gives you potentially better protection against all the other variants that are going to come along later.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions on boosters. Is one being developed that's going to bash Omicron on the head, and will we get it in time, really, I think is the other question.
Yeah, I mean, I have to be careful what I say here, but I suppose, so, I mean, lots of the vaccine manufacturers, the mRNA companies in particular, market themselves on this platform being very rapidly adaptive to new variants. But in all honesty, we've yet to see that. And I know that they've developed vaccines against beta variants, but beta's been and gone, and we're now on Omicron. So what to say?
Are they going to develop a broader, approach one? I mean, originally they were quite broad anyway. Can they make them broader?
Yeah, I mean, I think multivalent ones may be a way to go to hedge your bets. And of course, there's lots of great science out there, just as there has been for flu for years, to try and make a universal one, which will, cover as many that you can predict will ever happen. I've always said that's a really tough challenge. We haven't managed it yet for flu. I hope we do, and I hope we get there for SARS-CoV-2. And there's some great ideas that are being tested at the moment. But in the short term here, where we're talking, in the next 6 to 9 months, I don't see that happening. So I don't think we're going to have an Omicron vaccine, but for the UK, let's say, until Omicron's been and gone.
A few people are asking me, can you have too many boosters? Does your immune system get fed up or exhausted from being stimulated too many times? And is that a potential risk?
I don't think we've got any evidence that that's the case. The immune system, just responds. If you put a booster back in, it responds again. I think there is some data from Israel suggesting that when they tried a fourth booster to try and sort of combat Omicron even more than the third boosters were doing, it didn't really make much of a difference. So, I think there's a plateauing level at which you can keep boosting, and it maybe doesn't get you where you need to be. And that's why I would advocate keeping an eye on the genetic changes and either updating vaccines rapidly, and I'd love to see it happening more fast, or going for multivalent or broadly reactive ones.
Right. So I guess this takes us really onto the future. What does this mean going forward? Are we going to see, do you see we're going to have another booster in this year? Or do you think we're going to start a more selective booster approach?
Yeah, I think that probably if we see Omicron heralding, let's say, a new era of SARS-CoV-2, where we have a relatively mild virus in most people, I don't think there will be an appetite to keep vaccinating everybody against that kind of virus. And I think what we've got to really get good at is identifying who needs boosters, who needs updated vaccines, and using the vaccines to the best effect there.
And any views, I mean, the original rationale for doing children was that the vaccine would prevent transmission. And that's no longer really the case. So it does change some of these preconceived ideas we have, doesn't it? And it's changing fast, these rules. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think you're right. But, I think that children do still get, a pretty nasty cold, and we still do have a policy that means that they may well need to be absent from school. That has impacts on their education and their mental health. And so I think there are so many, I mean, this is a real JCVI, tricky question. And it's a changing environment, as you say, but overall, I think priming everybody up with some level of vaccine-induced immunity against this class of viruses, it seems to be a very good thing for everybody's health for very many reasons. Where we go after that, I think, is the next discussion in terms of future variants and future vulnerable people.
Yeah, and I think the debate needs to go on from, transmitting it to people getting recurrent infections, which will keep them away from work or keep them away from school. And I think that's the new debate, really, isn't it? I think this is in all sectors. So I think we need to update really our ethical questions in a different way. Do you think things are going to get better from here on, or what's your crystal ball telling you? About is there going to be another wave? Is something going to be worse than Omicron in terms of cases, or do you think the rest is all manageable?
So the good news, I think, is that we do seem to have a good basal level of immunity as a consequence of widespread use of vaccines and fantastic take-up by the public, which is great. And I think there's good evidence that even with an antigenically distant variant like Omicron, that vaccine is reducing severe disease, hospitalization, and death. So I think that's all good, and I think we've set up well. I think Omicron, in many ways, has been a lucky escape for us this winter, in that it is an inherently milder virus than Delta was. And if Delta type virus had emerged with the same level of antigenic escape that Omicron has, we could have been in a much worse situation, because it could have broken through that vaccine protection more severely than we've seen with Omicron. So, the lower number of hospitalizations and deaths is a combination at the moment of good vaccine use, but also of the fact that we're faced with a milder virus anyway than we might have seen. And I think the big unknown for people like me at the moment is, how will the virus go next? And is antigenic escape necessarily driving milder infection? Or will the next solution for the virus be a different combination of perhaps antigenic escape, but severe infection? And we can't exclude that at the moment, because we don't understand why Omicron has changed its behavior in the way it has. Is it a necessary consequence for the virus of this change in antigenic characteristics or not? Can they be uncoupled? And so that's, intense research, big questions we have to understand. There are a number of other worrying things out there. So we've seen the virus hop back into certain animal species from where it could always re-emerge in the future. And we need to keep an eye on that. And I think thinking back to where Omicron and all the other variants have come from in the first place, there's some evidence that chronically infected people sort of incubate the virus for a very long time and sort of give rise to these variants. And there are many, many thousands of those people around the world. So I don't think this is the last variant. We'll see. I don't know at the moment what the characteristics of the next variant will be. And, you know, I think that if we continue to see this trend in downwards severity after another 1 or 2 variants, I will feel a lot more comfortable in saying, yes, let's relax.
Okay, well, I don't, anyone's predicting this, it won't be another wave, though. So I think we're stuck with this, and we just got to learn how to live with it more. I've got one final tricky question for you. I'm getting lots of people on my Twitter account asking me that there have been mild symptoms, went away after 3 days, 10 days later, they're still testing positive a lateral flow test. Are they still infectious?
Yeah, I mean, with Omicron,
with
Omicron, I don't know unless I put their swab onto cells and ask that, or whether or not we test what they're emitting into the air. Is it infectious? Those are the best ways to know those. You know, as I mentioned, human challenge study is one way to go, or intense household studies where we've done with the attack study that we were involved with, where we follow up with proper cultured virology to understand if you're still infectious. I mean,
what's your hunch?
Well, logically speaking, lateral flow tests pick up a fragment of the virus that could be left behind for some time after there's active virus replication going on. In addition, I tend to think that infectiousness peaks earlier, and that as a person gets symptoms and responds to the viral infection they've got, there are all kinds of changes in their nose, innate immunity, mucus, that actually impact the infectivity of the virus. So they're probably not, but, you know, I can't rule it out. And just like we saw with PCR, it's a problem. And I think we just need more research and more virology culture assays to understand that, I'm afraid.
Okay, well, these are all fantastic ways to wrap this up, because we know a lot about this, but there's still a lot we don't know. And we've all, I think, all playing our part at home as citizen scientists in this area. And so thanks for everyone for listening with Join. Thanks, Wendy, you were fantastic again. Fantastic questions from all of you guys. Just to remind you, the Zoe COVID study is an essential tool for this pandemic. Do keep logging. It gives us all this amazing data. And I think more and more we're going to have to learn how to deal with this ourselves, you know, through these sort of networks and answering these questions. There's some useful links on this channel you can find out more about. Do subscribe to Zoe on YouTube and Facebook for all updates. And finally, thank you to everyone, and see you again soon.